The weight of a gavel judge. Elias Mercer had seen 1,000 storms from the bench. He had presided over broken marriages, bitter custody fights, embezzlement that smelled like desperation and greed. He had seen the way fear could change a person's voice, the way power could bend truth until it snapped. But nothing he had ever ruled on prepared him for the envelope that arrived on a Monday in late October, slipped under his front door while the house still slept. Inside was one sheet, heavy stock, typed in a slow, purposeful font that suggested patience, and patience seldom signals kindness. The message was simple, the threat precise. Do what I want. Let me go, or I will make sure your family finds out what happens when you are not home. No signature. No line you could trace, just a promise with teeth. Elias sat at his kitchen table in the pale hour before dawn, the paper trembling in his hands more from a memory than from the ink. His wife Anna slept on. She had worked the late shift at the clinic and would need full rest for the day. Their son, Michael, who was a senior at a local high school and already taller than his father, had a biology paper to finish. They deserved normalcy. They deserved safety. Elias folded the paper neatly and put it in the top drawer with his old law school notes, as if placing it next to the past could keep it from staining the present. He had been compromised once. 20 years earlier, a night of poor judgment in a college town had produced a young man's arrest, later overturned on a technicality Elias had been part of. It was a story the press could dig up if they wanted to, a whisper that had followed him through campaigns and confirmations. He had paid the price, private shame, a quiet reprimand, a vow never to let that man stand where he belonged. It had shaped his career, made him meticulous, maybe even ruthless, about due process. When Detective Mark Holt had shown up at his chambers 2 weeks later, the city's badge flashing like a mirror in the window, Elias thought he was there to warn him, to help tighten security. Instead, Holt had smiled like a man who believed in his own cleverness. "You made an enemy," Holt said, in a voice too low for the courtroom. "You made a lot of enemies." Elias's jaw went hard. "I don't know what you mean." Holt leaned in, lowering his voice further until it was a rasp. "You upheld the law. That hurts people. People who can make things difficult. You walk a dangerous line, Judge. You should be careful who you step on." It was a threat served with the thin veneer of a warning. Holt left. The smell of his cologne lingered like a warning bell. Elias did what judges do when the law touched their own lives. He catalogued, he weighed, he strategized. Yet law needs more than thought. It needs evidence, and the paper under his drawer. Holt's parting smile. Both were proof that someone wanted him to bow. There are moments when a judge must decide whether the scales he holds are made only for other people, or whether they must, in rare and terrible truth, be used for himself. Elias sat on that decision like a man on a precipice. If he did not act, Holt's voice would not be the only one that moved in the dark. Holt had ways. Contacts who could reach into contractors' email accounts, who could make threats over a meal at a restaurant, who could leave a little terror where the family watched television. Elias thought about Anna's hands tying Michael's shoelaces years ago, about the handful of Halloween pumpkins on their porch, about the small domestic peace that could sprout thorns if plucked. He was compromised, yes. But complicit he would not allow himself to be. Elias did what he had always told attorneys to do: gather facts, build a record, and act with law as the instrument of change. He called an old friend from the state attorney's office, Maya Ortega, someone who had studied with him, someone who kept her oath to the law like a lantern in a storm. He told her carefully about the envelope and Holt's visits. He did not tell her everything at once. Judges have to preserve integrity, even when it is the judge who is threatened. Maya's face in the tiny video tile was an island of resolve. "We'll open an internal affairs probe," she said. "We'll keep your family out of the loop for now. Don't make any public moves." That was both comfort and prison. Elias knew internal affairs for what it was: a slow and careful animal, excellent at building airtight cases, but not always speedy enough when threats whispered outside the courthouse. So Elias did something else. He hired Halcyon Investigations, an agency that lived in the margins between good police work and hired discreet teeth. He would not call on friends in blue to investigate another cop. That was a conflict the judiciary could not wash. Halcyon's lead investigator, Claire Hammond, had a reputation for finding what people wanted hidden. She called Elias back the same day. "I don't do favors," Claire said over the phone. "I do work. Send me everything." Elias sent the envelope. Holt's name and badge number, obtained from a security-conscious courthouse clerk, the dates of Holt's visits, and a sketch of every encounter that felt like pressure. Claire arrived at the Mercer house with a folder that smelled like coffee and the competence of someone who had seen too many broken things to be sentimental. She did not promise safety. She promised results. Halcyon became Elias's other bench. Claire and her team worked in the way that good detectives do, quietly, with patience, looking for patterns. They traced Holt's off-grid meetings, discreet cash flows through shell companies registered to a charity with no public presence, a shadowed courier who delivered envelopes in the dead of night. They cataloged Holt's friends, a brawny bail bondsman with a history of threats, a private security consultant who had spent more nights in county jails than in courts, and a businessman named Arthur Keene whose investments were as clean as glass and twice as brittle. Most importantly, Claire's team found a network of contacts that reached farther than a single crooked cop. Holt's leverage lay not only in threats but in relationships, men and women who profited when law was optional. Contractors rigged bidding. Judges were bribed with convenient favors. Businessmen laundered money with the casual efficiency of those who had done it all their lives. And somewhere along those lines, Halcyon found an old string of extortion messages, emails that tied Holt and Keene to a string of violence that had gone unsolved, phones turned off, witnesses scared away, files misfiled. Elias watched the discovery unfold like a man watching snowfall, one flake at a time, and then a covering that hid everything that had come before. The discovery changed him. He had believed in the system. The law worked if the people in it were people of honor. But the law had teeth only when people pointed them at the right place. Holt's network had taken advantage of the blind spots. When Halcyon presented the first dossier, bank transfers, digital footprints, a courier's manifest, Elias felt the old, cold certainty of the law settle in his bones. Maya moved internal affairs forward with the speed of an organization that suddenly realized the blowback would reach City Hall if they didn't act. Search warrants were drawn. Subpoenas were served. The bail bondsman found a warrant tucked into his morning mail with that same unromantic finality that only the law can produce. Holt didn't act rashly. He had practiced fear as an artist practices restraint, but he underestimated a judge's resolve and the tenacity of people like Claire and Maya. He underestimated an accuser who had nothing left to protect but the people he loved. The arrest began. In the pale light of an early winter morning, Halcyon coordinated with internal affairs. SWAT teams moved carefully, respectful of the law, because Elias could not bear a crusade that traded violence for justice. The bail bondsman was picked up before he could destroy a cache of ledgers. The private security consultant was found taking a nap at a diner, balled into a booth like a tired prizefighter. Keene's compound, neat hedges, tasteful art, was breached not by thunder, but by paperwork and the long, steady process of forensics. It would be easy to write those arrests as the climax of the story, as if once the contacts were in custody, Holt's power would evaporate like mist. But corruption is not a single night. It is a slow economy, a market for favors and an infrastructure for silence. Keene and his people were not merely arrested for the envelope under a door. They were arrestable for a list of crimes that had been long enough to make a prosecutor's jaw set. Fraud, extortion, conspiracy, complicity in assaults. Each charge was a thread in the web, and once the threads were tugged, the whole net tightened. Holt watched from a distance, his face a map of disbelief. He had expected leverage to buy him time, to force Elias to recuse himself, to make the judge's life so complicated that the law bent like wet paper. Instead, Holt found himself isolated. His contacts, when shown ink and warrants, turned inward like a hive shivering from a blow. Some of them cut deals. Some threatened. Few stood by him in the way false friends do. The real test came when Elias took the bench and issued an order that would seal Holt's fate. Judges do not preside over themselves. They preside over the law. But Elias saw the underside of a system that depended on human courage and human failure. He could have recused, had he wished to hide in the sensible anonymity that many judges adopt when their own shadows cross the threshold. He did not. In open court, with attorneys arranged like careful chess pieces, Elias read the affidavit aloud. It was procedural, technical, dry, by design. The law speaks in precise terms because imprecision is the playground of tyrants. But when Elias spoke, there was a human cadence beneath the legal language, a fatigue, a wounded patience, a refusal to kneel. Holt's arraignment was stark. The courtroom crowded with cameras that tastefully blurred faces of those who wanted to watch another man fall. Holt, once swaggering, now looked like a man who had misplaced his map. The prosecutor's case was not a sermon. It was a ledger, transactions, recorded threats, surveillance footage of meetings, witness testimony. The defense tried a clean, swift dismissal, insufficient evidence, procedural errors. But Maya's team had built a scaffold of facts that was as immovable as a cliff. And then, the extraordinary, one of Holt's contacts, an enforcer who had been tough in the alleys and heavy-handed in the parking lots, sat in a witness chair and told the truth. He said it haltingly, like a man who had kept a criminal secret for years and had not yet learned how to live without it. He confessed to arranging surveillance on Elias's family. He described money funneling through a shell company into a bank account in exchange for silence. Under oath, with a judge who had been threatened presiding, the man's confession sounded like a bell. The confession was the kind of thing that makes law books come alive. It was messy and human and undeniable. Holt's lawyer tried to discredit him. Motive to lie, deals struck for leniency. But even the counsel could not scrub away the ledger entries, the courier manifests, the old photos found in a safe. Holt was sentenced not merely for the attempt to intimidate a judge, but for the crimes that had made his intimidation possible. The sentencing was not a spectacle. Instead, it was a measured application of penalties the law reserved for those who used their badge as a club and their network as a shield. Holt received time that matched the harm he had orchestrated. His contacts received their own measures of justice. After the gavel fell and the court emptied, Elias lingered. He thought of all the people who had trusted the law to be more than a set of rules. He thought of Anna's hands in the dark, of Michael's laugh, of the porch light left on for late nights. He thought of the fact that he had been compromised, yes, but that compromise did not mean capitulation. The city did not transform overnight. There were headlines and editorials and a cautious reopening of trust. Internal Affairs issued reports reforming oversight. Council members argued, loudly and publicly, about whether the system was adequate. But for Elias, the story narrowed to a single truth. Power unchecked becomes a predator. The law is not an ivory tower. It is a tool that belongs to everyone. It demands caretakers who will use it, not hoard it. Halcyon closed its file. Claire sent Elias a one-line email that said simply, "It's done." Elias replied with thanks and a photograph of his family at Thanksgiving, light on the porch, candles making halos on the table. He did not include the paper threat. There was no need. In the quiet after, Elias walked his son to the bus stop one morning, just like any other father. Michael shoved his hands into his jacket pockets and complained about calculus. Anna kissed Elias at the crosswalk and said, "You did good." She meant the small private things, coming home, showing up for school concerts, making the coffee. But she also meant the larger thing, that he had used what he had, the gavel, the law, the persistence, to protect a fragile peace. Justice, Elias thought, is not always a thunderclap. Often it is a series of small, stubborn acts that resist the easy corruption of fear. He had been compromised, yes. He had been imperfect, but in the end, he had done what the system demanded. He had assembled facts, sought counsel, and brought those who did harm to account in the only place that matters, the courtroom where truth can be proven, where testimony has weight, where law is more than an instrument of revenge. The city kept spinning. New cases filled the docket. Holt's name faded into the background noise of a legal community that never sleeps. Arthur Keene's properties were managed by court-appointed trustees. The bail bondsman found a quieter life. Some of Holt's lesser accomplices were out on the streets again months later, as the world does not remain tidy for long. That bothered Elias because justice is rarely absolute. But the main instrument, the network that enabled the threats, had been cut down. The message had been delivered. You do not threaten the family of a judge and expect the system to look away. On an evening months after the arrests, Elias stood at his kitchen window and watched the neighborhood children play under streetlights. Michael helped a little girl onto the jungle gym and laughed when she squealed. Anna cooked and hummed to a song from the radio. The envelope that had once weighed like a guillotine now sat in the bottom drawer, a relic of an old and ugly season. Elias knew, as any careful man of the law knows, that vigilance was not a one-time act. It was a life sentence he accepted gladly. He would not promise he would never be compromised. Again, humans err, but he would promise to meet the darkness with the instruments of law and the courage of a man who would not let fear dictate his life. The gavel would come down again and again. But when it did, for the Mercer family, and perhaps for the city that watched, it would be in the steady rhythm of someone who remembered the price of silence and chose instead to speak, with the full force of law behind him. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to hit the like button. It helps more people discover it. Share your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if you enjoy stories of justice, resilience, and truth, make sure you subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss next videos. Together we keep these stories alive.